It's a great honor for me to be here at the Empire Club of Canada today, which is arguably the most famous and historically relevant speakers podium to have ever existed in Canada. It has offered its podium to such international luminaries as Winston Churchill, Ronald Reagan, Audrey Hepburn, the Dalai Lama, Indira Gandhi, and closer to home, from Pierre Trudeau to Justin Trudeau. Literally generations of our great nation's leaders, alongside with those of the world's top international diplomats, heads of state, and business and thought leaders.
It is a real honor and a distinct privilege to be invited to speak to the Empire Club of Canada, which has been welcoming international diplomats, leaders in business and in science and in politics. When they stand at that podium, they speak not only to the entire country, but they can speak to the entire world.
Good afternoon, fellow directors, past presidents, members, and guests. Welcome to the 117th season of the Empire Club of Canada. My name is Antoinette Tamilo. I'm the president of the Empire Club and your host for today's virtual event, Indigenomics, the Emerging Strength of the Indigenous Economy. I'd like to begin this afternoon with an acknowledgement that the land we are broadcasting from is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. For those of you tuning in from regions across the country today, we encourage you to learn more about the traditional territory on which you work or live. Now, for a moment to recognize our sponsors who generously support the Empire Club and make these events possible. Thank you to our lead sponsor, TD Bank, our supporting sponsors, Deloitte, Tres Capital, BDC, and RBC, and our seasoned sponsors, the Canadian Bankers Association and Waste Connections of Canada. I also want to thank our event partner, BBC and livemeeting.ca, for webcasting today's event. Now, for a few logistical items. If you're finding your internet feed is slow, please see below and click the Switch Streams button. And don't hesitate to press the Request for Help button that's available to you if you're experiencing technical difficulties. Our team will be more than happy to assist you. I also want to remind everyone on this call that this is an interactive event. So we encourage you to take advantage of the question box to the right of your screen and send in your questions. We have saved some time at the end for the panelists to address your questions. It is now my pleasure to call this meeting to order. In this lifetime, we will all witness the most important rebuilding and design of Indigenous economies for Indigenous peoples across the world. One of the most important Indigenous economies is in Canada. Our expert panel will discuss the new models of commercial partnership and the economic strength that is emerging in our Indigenous communities and why it is important for all Canadians. The immense power on the culture of Canada and the 100 billion emerging economy cannot be ignored. Undoubtedly, access to financial capital will aid in reducing barriers to Indigenous business owners and communities, including land and water right issues. Our expert panel will take a deep dive into the modern political, economic, and development objectives for Indigenous communities and how the growth of the economy is essential to Canada's and your future. They will also weigh in on the importance of support for the economic growth and what it will mean for Canada as a whole. Before we begin, let me introduce our panelists. Carol Ann Hilton is a dynamic national Indigenous business leader, author, speaker, and senior advisor. She is the CEO and founder of the Indigenomics Institute. She has led the establishment of the line of thought called #Indigenomics, growing from a single word to an entire movement that focuses on the rebuilding and strengthening of Indigenous economies. She has authored a book on the subject, so you can learn more about it, called Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table. A few more notable tidbits on Carol Ann. She was also the only Indigenous person appointed to the Canadian Economic Growth Council as a senior advisor to the federal finance minister. She serves as a director on the McGill University Institute for the Study of Canada, the BC Digital Supercluster, as well as on MyTax. She's also an adjunct professor at Royal Roads University School of Business. Carol Ann is of Nuu-chah-nulth descent from Hesquiat Nation on Vancouver Island. We also have Heather Berthollet. She has served as CEO of the Tribal Councils Investment Group since 2015. Heather brings her unique perspective on the First Nations' need for self-sufficiency and economic development through her personal passion and connection to her First Nations Métis roots. Tribal Council Investment is owned by the 7 tribal councils of Manitoba, which represents approximately 150,000 First Nations. She also created the Spirit of Healthcare group of companies. The Spirit's business model and overall vision is to advance and equalize healthcare for Indigenous people. This business model embodies the concept of Indigenomics. And our moderator today is Alicia Dubois. Alicia is a proud Indigenous professional who joined the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation from CIBC's executive team, where she developed and implemented CIBC's Indigenous market strategy and framework. Alicia continues her dedication to Indigenous economic prosperity and wellness by bolstering Indigenous access to capital and the economy and supporting meaningful Indigenous ownership in mid to large scale resource and related infrastructure projects. Alicia is the co-chair of the board of directors of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business and served as a member of the board of trustees of the Royal Ontario Museum. In 2019, Alicia was honored with the National Aboriginal Trust Officers Association's inaugural Award of Distinction for her steadfast commitment to Indigenous prosperity and self-determination. Prior to her career in Indigenous financial services, Alicia practiced law at Alberta Justice, NMAX Corporation, and Native Child and Family Services of Toronto. So you see, we indeed have a very expert panel here today. So I will now turn it over to Carol Ann Hilton to deliver a few remarks, and then she will turn it over to Alicia Dubois for the moderated discussion.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome, Antoinette. Bringing together this centering concept of Indigenous peoples are taking our seat at the economic table and the emerging foundation of Indigenous economic strength. As we begin, I wanted to reflect that I am here on Lekwungen territory in Victoria, BC. I wanted to acknowledge my roots of being a Hesquiat woman and that my Nuu-chah-nulth name is Wakatush, which means big sister. I wanted to reflect and center this dialogue and conversation that I am the first generation out of residential school. I am the 5th generation since the establishment of the Indian Act. My daughter is the 6th generation since the establishment of the Indian Act, and my grandchildren will be the 7th generation. As we begin, I wanted to reflect on this concept of the #Indigenomics. I wanted to be able to demonstrate this as a point of the ability to distribute stories around Indigenous business success and challenges, to establish a thread of content, a volume of work through the perception of the media lens of Canadian reality. The origin of this concept of Indigenomics as a hashtag is essentially beginning to insert this concept and build themes and perceptions around emerging Indigenous economic strength. In understanding what Indigenomics is, I introduce the concepts as simply economics from an Indigenous worldview. I want to introduce the concept of economic distortion, that the establishment of this country has been built on the foundation of the concept of the Indian problem. I draw from the words of Duncan Campbell Scott, who in the early policy shaping and the regulatory environment of this country described the Indian problem in the words that we need to get rid of the Indian problem. I suggest that this thread of perception has existed across the entirety of the existence of Canada itself and has deeply influenced the lens with which we see and experience our Indigenous relationship within this country across time and today. It is in this lens of distortion that I introduce the concept of economic distortion, to essentially be able to understand that the concept of Indigenomics is modern, constructive, generative economic design. At my time at the Canadian Economic Growth Council, the numbers were reflected to me, and at the time it was in a 2016 context, that the entirety of the Indigenous spend reflected in an equation where we saw 96% of the entire annual federal transfer to Indigenous peoples and partners, looking at 96% socially based. So education, management, health. 2% of that annual transfer budget was earmarked to reconciliation, which left 2% for economic development. We are living in a country that the fiscal equation does not make sense. This is a classic example of the social cart pulling the economic horse. To have prosperous, generative, constructive Indigenous economies, 2% of federal program and service transfer does not equate to the foundation and the elevation of Indigenous economic strength. I want to be able to describe this concept of Indigenomics as modern, constructive, generative economic design. It is in my time at the Federal Economic Growth Council that I actually realized that there was a piecemeal or a program and service approach to the Indigenous economy. That the concept that the Indigenous economy exists was best articulated through the TD Economic Report over a series of which the last one was in 2016 and described the size of the Indigenous economy around 32 billion. My work at the Institute has essentially been facilitating this concept of Indigenomics as a response. To be able to understand and build from this idea, Indigenomics is the response. It's the response to poverty. It's the response to this understanding of negative statistics, of high numbers of Indigenous peoples in jail, and a response to this concept of economic distortion and regression and isolation over time. To be able to understand Indigenomics is the response. Essentially, this is about the time of convening the tools, the structures, the resources, and the leadership in the emerging Indigenous economy. My book, Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table, is essentially about isolating a story based on the truth of systemic Indigenous economic exclusion, being able to demonstrate the impacts of that today, and to be able to build a new collective future that intrinsically ties Indigenous economic success to our success as a country. Indigenomics is the response. To be able to understand the nature, the leadership of our collective response. To be able to convene the tools, the structures, the resources, and the leadership in the emerging Indigenous economy. This is essentially about our ability to understand and describe a new story, where we see ourselves in the story. There are so many times we hear that, but I wasn't part of that. That wasn't my generation. The effects of economic distortion are still being felt today. To understand that the growth of the Indigenous economy is happening in spite of. It's happening in spite of undercapitalization. It's happening in spite of the lack of structure. It's happening in spite of the lack of design. And it's happening in spite of the lack of leadership focus on establishing a target of expectation. The language of the status quo, the absence of any performance measures of Indigenous economy, is a reflection of the state of the Indigenous relationship within this country. To value Indigenous economic generation is true leadership to say the Indigenous relationship is one of the most important ones that we have within this country. It is in this leadership that the Indigenomics Institute facilitates the potential of a $100 billion annual Indigenous economy. The concept is essentially not so much about the achievement of the 100 billion as it is about inserting into Canadian reality the potential of Indigenous economic strength. The concept of the $100 billion Indigenous economy is future pacing Canada's economic reality to shift from the status quo to Indigenous economic empowerment. $100 billion is a representative of Indigenous economic empowerment. This economic empowerment has emerged from within the legal relationship of this country. In the work of my good friend and colleague, Bill Gallagher, who describes that there are now 312 cases where Indigenous peoples have won within the courtroom, and within this legal spectrum have established this new economic space. It is in this space that the $100 billion annual Indigenous economy is possible. We are in a push and pull dynamic within this country, where Indigenous legal cases push Canada into a new economic reality. When we understand this dynamic and we facilitate the points of convening economic structure and design, this is Indigenomics. The concept of being able to future pace Canada's economic reality to the potential of a $100 billion Indigenous economy. If we understand that pre-COVID, essentially to understand that 5% of the Canadian population is Indigenous, to establish and align 5% of Canada's Indigenous economic generation would essentially liken to a $100 billion Indigenous economy. To be able to live within the constructs and limitations of the Indian Act is the status quo. To be able to facilitate the long-term effects of economic regression, to develop the structures and institutions of the expression of an Indigenous right to an economy, that is Indigenomics. We as a country are adapting to this new reality that Indigenous peoples have a right to an economy. To essentially be able to understand that Indigenomics is an invitation. It is an invitation into our leadership. It is an invitation to address the perceptions of the problem lens with which we have inherited in the development of this country. The fundamental question that I ask is, who wants to play Indigenomics? This is a call to our leadership. This is a call to our collective response. This is a call to what is the place, the rules, the structures, tools, and the conversations that we have in our offices, that we have at our homes, and that we have within our personal relationships and professional relationships. To be understanding of that the central concept of Indigenous economic empowerment is the new normal within this country, that Indigenous peoples are an economic powerhouse. This is the greatest power play this country has never seen coming. The $100 billion Indigenous economy is not only possible, we are looking at it. And it is essential that our collective response is reflected within our leadership and that we establish the institutions and we accept the invitation of who wants to play Indigenomics. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carol Ann, and thank you to the Empire Club of Canada for hosting this conversation. Carol Ann, your thoughts and insights are illuminating as an understatement. Respectfully, I acknowledge that I'm presenting today from Treaty 7 traditional land and Alberta Métis Nation lands specific to Region 3. I was asked to provide a few introductory thoughts before heading into the questions. So I'll start with some patterns and trends that I am personally and professionally observing, and I'll highlight why it's important for Canadians to pay attention to them. So like Carol Ann alluded to, based on my years of practicing law before entering Indigenous finance, I noted and watched as case law and legal precedent set the stage for a shift in Indigenous rights. And this gave rise to the shift we're experiencing now with respect to the placement of Indigenous peoples in society and in the economy. The result is that Indigenous peoples are moving from a marginalized or peripheral position to a much more central and integral position as active players and drivers in the economy. Both national and international influences or pressures are strengthening and solidifying the position and influence of Indigenous peoples in the economy for the betterment of all. In order to recover and grow our economy, we need to get many things right, but it also includes being positioned to attract investment. And to do so, we must get the Indigenous, non-Indigenous relationship right. We must ensure that Indigenous peoples and communities are positioned to be actively engaged in regional economic development initiatives, because it's been shown that Indigenous participation is necessary to drive regional economies, and that Indigenous peoples being at the table is a strategic advantage, particularly when we are talking about natural resource development. Other significant and relatively recent pressures relate to ESG considerations. Indigenous peoples are positioned to contribute positively to each of the constituents of ESG. And lastly, getting Indigenous partnerships and participations right in any operation enhances the industry players and frankly Canada's overall reputation, brand, and ability to attract investors. Understanding the benefits of and necessity for active Indigenous participation and partnerships in the economy in order to grow the economy and create prosperity for all, being Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, is the fundamental tenet of the mandate I lead at the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. Since taking this position, I'm truly inspired to see there is a real appetite for Indigenous investment and ownership in natural resource projects, both by Indigenous communities and very strongly by industry players also. As you say, Carol Ann, the time is now. I'd like to open up to with some questions specific for you, Carol Ann, and then I'll move to questions for Heather. So as I just said, and as you said in your book, the time is now. Can you explain why that's important?
For sure, absolutely. Indigenomics is essentially about reshaping our economic dialogue, repositioning that from problem to opportunity. I ask the question, what do we really know about the Indigenous economy? When we begin to understand the actual projections of Indigenous revenue created through our economic development corporations and Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs, having a fuller picture of that, beginning to understand the investment requirements and the investment limitations that currently exist, all of those are essential components to be able to build our response to now. Are we operating from an old story or are we building a new story? That is the choice that we are at within this country. we can address the challenges of Indigenous economic empowerment and invest into the structure of Indigenous economic design. In closing, I refer to two specific pieces of research. The Atlantic Collective regional provinces identified that Indigenous economic activity was just under $2 billion annually. I reflect on a Manitoba regional report that identified Indigenous annual economic activity was just under 9 billion. If we create a slate across the provinces and the territories that demonstrate annual Indigenous economic contribution or generation, we can easily see that $100 billion Indigenous economy is so close that we are looking at that. Being able to reshape our economic dialogue is the time that we are having. Our conversations need to be led by concepts of design, investment, and leadership. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. Yesterday, we saw the presentation of the 2021 budget. Do you have any initial reflections you'd like to share on that?
Absolutely. I refer to this concept of investment into this addressing the socioeconomic gap. I believe very firmly that the language of the socioeconomic gap describes the fallacy of the language of deficit, and it describes in itself as a concept. The socioeconomic gap is the effect of long-term Indigenous economic exclusion. It is time to measure Indigenous economic strength. Has the ability to actually measure the socioeconomic gap created anything other than a story that says the gap really hasn't closed? To be able to invest in closing the gap versus investing in Indigenous economic empowerment, that is the place, the sweet spot, to be able to address the fiscal equation of this country. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. I'm actually going to take a question that has come in from the audience. So specifically from Chantel, she asks Caroline, what institutions do you think play the biggest roles in Indigenomics?
For sure, that's a great question. I think that we're looking at leadership from the financial sector to be able to reprofile Indigenous investment away from a risk profile to a strategic option of investment and design in the evolution of Canada's COVID economic response and a response to Indigenous economic empowerment.
Great. We also have another question from Jason, and it's specific to Indigenous engagement as part of the supply chain in businesses. He observes that through his experience, he has found that perhaps he's operating within a concept of unconscious biases based on perceptions that he's an Indigenous business owner, are not able to serve or deliver products competitively in contrast to non-Indigenous businesses. What are your thoughts on that?
I refer to the work of Australia, who have demonstrated tremendous leadership of the concept of reconciliation within the supply chain of the country. To be able to address that concept of seeing the value spectrum of reconciliation, places of inclusion, and the ability to construct relationships and new actions from, that is essentially what inclusion can look like. Thank you.
Okay. And another question from Jay. Regarding the funding allocations to Indigenous communities in Canada, is it merely a matter of better allocation of the direct funding, i.e. a shift from 96% in social spending toward economic development spending? Or is there a more holistic approach required, which could include higher amounts of budgeting? Are there any ROI statistics available for such an approach?
Absolutely. I fundamentally believe this concept that the growth of the Indigenous economy cannot exist within programs and services. An annual budget, an annual program, or investment in that is not sufficient to support the growth of the Indigenous economy. As we look at the unfolding of the right to an economy, Indigenous peoples are the only ones who have had to position and establish that right. I draw on this concept of economic distortion, of the lens with which we view Indigenous people as a cost on the system. As long as we look at financial allocation as the means towards Indigenous economic growth, the fallout and the limitations of that approach is essentially the requirement for structures and institutions that are led by Indigenous people. That is where we will see the power play of the dimension of the true potential of the Indigenous economy.
Great. We have a number of questions coming in. I'm so pleased. So please, audience, continue with them. The next question is from Alex. I would like to know more about the various types of industries that Indigenomics is constituted for.
Indigenomics is not constituted for any specific industry. Indigenomics is paying attention to what is already happening. It's happening at an organic level in terms of in the field of Indigenous nations, building economic partnerships, building financial relationships. It's what's already happening. It's the financial architecture. It's the economic playing field. To say Indigenomics exists within specific industries is really beginning to pay attention to the concept, our leadership, and what a collective response can look like.
Okay. Another question from Mark. What is the first step non-Indigenous business leaders can take to help?
For sure, that is a great question. I think it's about building relationships, building partnerships. I think it's essentially about Indigenous peoples taking seats on boards. It's about equity pathways to to ownership in major projects. It's about a financial response and investment into Indigenous partnerships and opening doors, opening conversations, and the realization of Indigenous economic strength.
Great. And I do have a question that has come up for Heather, but perhaps I'll revisit that in a few minutes. So, Carol-Ann, yesterday there was a big headline with respect to a decision from the BC Court of Appeal, and it's particular to your area. Tell us about what that was about, why it's important, and why we should be paying attention.
For sure. So I am a direct descendant of the Nuu-chah-nulth people who essentially took Canada to court under the concept that our reserve systems had removed our rights to an economy, that our access to the ocean was essentially eliminated through various acts, authorities, and policies. We won that court case. And what is important to know about that is that one of the big ways that we were able to win that was through the eyes of the first explorers that came into our territory. When we realized that what had been documented through the first explorers in our territories, when those boats came in, our people went and brought canoe loads of fish and proceeded to trade and welcome those boats. Understanding that as a fundamental structure of exchange and the role of commerce within an Indigenous economy, what this case essentially did was pulled our Indigenous experience right from first contact into modernity. When we understand that essentially that for a country to argue that Indigenous peoples do not have the right to exchange, we can't have it both ways. We can't be measuring the socioeconomic gap and also be removing the right to exchange fish for money. We need to choose. We are in a place and an intersection to be able to understand that of the win that was created yesterday, from my understanding, that was 312th win of Indigenous peoples in the courtroom of this country, that establishes our Nuu-chah-nulth place or a seat at the economic table. Our people were systematically disinvited to the economic table of this country. That was expressed through our inability to exchange fish for money. What was inserted into Canadian reality yesterday through this win, and while that may have been overshadowed by the excitement of the announcement of the budget, that was a significant headline that demonstrated Indigenous peoples are taking our seat at the economic table of this country. And our response is, everybody needs to be able to move over. Thank you.
Thanks. We have a question from Gail too. She states, Indigenous artists are high achievers in every field. What do you see as their role in Indigenomics?
I think that we see emerging Indigenous digital or virtual space, creating space for Indigenous artists and seeing them as the ability to have a foundational structure to Indigenous economy building. Artists are definitely included with that, and important emerging virtual spaces based in technology platforms is part of what the strength of we have seen in the emerging COVID pandemic in a much stronger way.
Thank you. So I'll ask a more general question of you, Caroline. What patterns or trends are you seeing in your work, and why should we be paying attention to these?
For sure. I refer to this concept of Indigenomics economic mix, which is 12 levers of design or enablers of Indigenous economic growth. These are patterns of hotspots of Indigenous economic activity. Some of these levers include equity ownership, capital, trade, entrepreneurship, procurement, looking at clean energy technology as examples. Those are emerging trends where we're seeing investment, the ability to build relationships. Over the last while, we see examples like the Canadian Infrastructure Bank prioritizing $1 billion of investment into Indigenous infrastructure, understanding those places as investment and ability to partner and grow and invest within. Thank you.
Great. So I have a question from James, and then we'll move over to expand the conversation to Heather. And actually, James poses this question for both you, Caroline, and Heather. So perhaps we can do a bit of a shift through the question. What strategic role do you see Indigenous peoples playing in our far north in protecting our sovereignty, both economically and on a foreign policy basis for Canada?
I think that the North is the secret sauce of economics within this country. I think understanding Northern Indigenous economic strength will be essential. If we look at that concept of regional or territorial annual contribution, if we look at the entirety of the North and develop a picture of Indigenous economic strength, that's really where it's at. Understanding fundamentally Indigenous inclusion into Canada's economic response, that is the strategic places that we need to be paying attention to instead of solely on the socioeconomic gap. Thank you.
Okay. And Heather, before you launch into that, I don't know if you would like to do an introduction, share some introductory comments, etc., but I'll open the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Alicia. I'd like to start by thanking the Empire Club. I would also like to begin by acknowledging that I am joining you from the beautiful Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. So TCIG has been the practice of Indigenomics for over 20 years now. So certainly the North has been one of our areas. The 7 tribal councils represent 150,000 First Nations, many of them being from Northern Manitoba. The collective work of the unity of the 7 chiefs and the strategic investments and buildings of businesses that we participated in. One of the current examples is we acquired a pharmacy that delivers to the nursing stations in Northern Manitoba. Pharmacy with 20 years of experience and expertise that expertise and experience came from building it with our communities. So our communities owning it, operating it, and now operating it with an Indigenous worldview in mind is an example of what Indigenomics in practice looks like.
That's great. I think that in those introductory comments, you have answered the question from Nancy that was raised earlier. But I did receive a very interesting question from Karen. So she specifically says, thank you for dispelling the socioeconomic gap narrative and unattainable collective goal. What would you recommend to Indigenous women to take their seat at the economic table? Heather, do you want to share your thoughts on that?
Sure. As a woman who joined the board of 7 First Nations chiefs, at the time, none of them were females, pulling your chair up to the table and knowing your space, knowing your why, what you need to achieve, that's all it takes. Just know your why and stay in the game. And yeah, that would be my advice.
Great, great. There's a question from Nick, and perhaps I'll chime in a little bit from the banking side and then hand it to you, Heather, too, for your thoughts from your organization's perspective. But his question is, what more can financial institutions do and offer Indigenous groups other than specialized financing and banking? And I think that the specialized financing and banking is very important because there are very particular nuances to banking on reserve and supporting Indigenous enterprises. They have to do with the way that income is recorded from an accounting perspective, all the way to how security is handled when establishing credit for Indigenous groups. But it's also about, I think, internal education. So those people who are working in Indigenous banking, I think, have a role to share insights and take a much more holistic view to raising awareness within their institutions outside of their business lines. That's very important because there are a number of intersections for financial institutions with Indigenous communities and peoples, be they economic development corporations or entrepreneurs. And it's about thought leadership. So being thought leaders and being sure to be present and use your platforms as influence to support meaningful partnerships between industry players and Indigenous communities or entrepreneurs. So those are my thoughts. What do you think, Heather?
You know, I really think that the banks have done a wonderful job of coming into the more modern perspective. We have partnered with large organizations like PepsiCo and Express Scripts Canada, who is now part of the Cigna company out of the States. And through those relationships, we've been able to expand on the banking relationship because all businesses need good banking partnerships. And I think that the banks in Canada have done a really good job of recognizing that.
Excellent. So we have a comment and then a question from Leah, and I find this very interesting. And perhaps there's a role for a voice from the Aboriginal financial institutions to weigh in here. But specifically, Leah says, a gap I have encountered in services available specific to being a small business Indigenous entrepreneur is accessing proper business education and startup funding. The same funding requirements are often expected from us as Indigenous peoples when economically we're coming from a place where many of us did not have the advantages that others did with respect to initial startup and personal capital, access to capital, assets, and those requirements to qualify. Can you speak to this and perhaps offer suggestions?
Sure. One of the companies that we've had for 20 years really works on building an Indigenous workforce. So making those gaps recognized and closed in. So we've worked with a lot of different organizations to be able to bring entrepreneurs and employees into the GTA in Toronto, into other metropolitan organizations, and try and line them up with the proper, tools that they need and the agencies that they can work with to get the education and get the funding, the capital they may need to get going. So there are several different organizations out there that can assist with that.
Great, thank you. So one question we have from Sonia, and I really like this question because we all know that the future is digital and there's a real requirement for us nationally to pay attention to connectivity for Indigenous communities because often the connectivity is very substandard. But specifically, Sonia asks, is digital skill development a priority for new prosperity? Where are you seeing this happen? Any thoughts on that, Heather?
Yeah, in Manitoba, we've really been working on connectivity to our northern communities. We've had an incredible concentration on it because it really is an equalizer. And I really do see it as being one of the key pillars that we are going to need to have under us to fully partake at the economic table. So I think it's all hands on deck, making sure that that missing connectivity link is filled in. I know we're working with several organizations out here in Manitoba, and several of the organizations of the 7 tribal councils have independently been addressing this issue.
Okay, thank you. I noticed that our time is coming near to a close, and Heather, we were hoping to hear about what is the concept of Indigenomics doing in this country from your perspective? What does that mean to Indigenous peoples and how they are taking a seat at the economic table?
As I mentioned, organizations like Tribal Council Investment Group have been around for 20 years. Growing, competitive, well-structured corporations seeking partnerships. So we've certainly proven that there's value in partnering with us, that it's not a sacrifice to your profit. It's not a solution to an issue or a way over a hurdle. It's economically beneficial to work with Indigenous people. And through the hard work of the Indigenomics Institute and CCAB championing it, measuring it, and now naming it for us, that's made a world of difference. And now really, as Carol Ann says, now really is our time. And yeah, I'm excited.
Excellent. So being mindful of time, I'm wondering, would we like to spend some time with some closing remarks perhaps? And I'm sorry because we do have additional questions that have come in from the audience, but I know that we wanted to have some time for closing remarks. So I'll leave it to you, Carol Ann and Heather, if you'd like me to continue with questions, or are there specific takeaways from today that you think are important to highlight before we close off?
For sure. Maybe Heather can go and I'll close.
Okay, sure. So I just really, for closing remarks, I'd like to say that Carol Ann, Indigenomics Institute, CCAB, it has been a pleasure being able to have you champion for us, for all Indigenous companies, small and big out there, that the unity that that brings to us is huge, meaningful, and we are very grateful.
Thank you so much, Heather. Very much appreciation of your leadership and insight. I just wanted to do some final comments, realizing in part of the budget that came out yesterday was this realization that we are set to hit $1 trillion in debt within this country. It is essential that the understanding and the shift of perception of seeing Indigenous peoples as having generative economies is an essential component to our response to now. We need to be able to understand that Indigenous peoples are taking our place in modernity. that essentially we must move away from this concept and experience of funding the problem to be able to understand Indigenous economic empowerment and its role within this country. I refer to this concept of Indian Act economics, that every single person in this country has in some way, shape, or form been negatively impacted by Indian Act economics. And while we have nations that are under other definitions of modern treaty or self-governance or hybrid versions of that, the long-term effects of that has single-handedly affected every single one of us that is on that call, that is on this call today. Canada deserves better than Indian Act economics. When we understand that the structures of Indigenous economic empowerment is the new normal, that Indigenous peoples are economic powerhouses, that is the new normal that we need to be able to build and respond from. The $100 billion Indigenous economy is not only possible, we are looking right at it. Let's have the courage to do this together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol-Ann and Heather. It has been a very interesting conversation today. It's something that, as I said earlier, I live every day, and watching the evolution of things in my short lifetime has really been astounding, actually. And I think about where Canada is going. We still have a lot of work to do, but there are so many incredible examples of Indigenous economic strength and meaningful contributions as a result of that to the regions that the communities find themselves in. There are many best practice examples to highlight. And while we don't necessarily get to see those in media, they are there. And I'm really proud to get the chance to showcase them and highlight them and offer them up as examples for other regions, industry players, and Indigenous communities or entrepreneurs to follow. So it's been a real honor. Thank you again to the Empire Club of Canada. And with that, I'll pass it back to Antoinette. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. I am now going to introduce Alan Polak, Managing Director and Head of Canadian Financial Sponsors at TD Securities, to deliver the appreciation remarks.
Thank you very much. We're very honored to act as event sponsor for today's important event. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I would like to thank Carol-Ann, Heather, and Alicia for providing an engaging and riveting discussion today and highlighting the tremendous importance of Indigenomics for our businesses, our communities, and our people. This is a bold and ambitious program that is worthy of our collective attention, focus, and energy. We are inspired by the $100 billion vision articulated today and the opportunity to achieve more for our communities, businesses, and people. At TD, we are committed to supporting a vibrant, dynamic, and prosperous future for Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge and actively support key milestones like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's call for corporate Canada to invest in education, employment, community, and economic development for the benefit of Indigenous people and communities. TD was honored to be chosen by the Saskatchewan Indian Equity Foundation and the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations to be a founding partner of the First Nations Bank of Canada. Today, FNBC is a majority Indigenous-owned bank and has its own banking platform and services, while TD retains a minority stake. We continue to maintain good working relationships with one another, in some cases combine the strengths of both banks to serve Indigenous customers. TD has an active Indigenous banking group which supports Indigenous communities through 1,100 locations, including 4 branches on reserve. In 2020, TD was mandated by the Canada Infrastructure Bank to assess the commercial feasibility and advise on structuring an innovative approach to financing and delivering new, revenue-generating infrastructure projects for Indigenous communities across Canada, the Indigenous Community Infrastructure Initiative. This effort culminated in the launch and official welcoming of applications from Indigenous communities for consideration to this loan program to provide low-cost, long-term financing to Indigenous communities in Canada to build necessary infrastructure within their communities. Again, I would like to thank today's speakers for the thoughtful and inspiring discussion, and we look forward to building together towards the vision of Indigenomics. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alan. And I want to thank our audience as well. Those were a lot of terrific questions. And unfortunately, we did run out of time asking some of those questions. But Alicia, you did a great job today, sticking those questions in. So thank you very much and moderating today. Thank you, Carol Ann. Thank you, Heather. This was a very informative discussion. And Alan, you also added some information there for all of us to take away. So again, thank you. I just want to take a moment to tell you about an upcoming event. We're having our own pre-Academy Awards event, so a little different than today, but it's one also about representation of people with disability on screen. So it's a work in progress. We're going to have Adam and Arshil Agoyan with Christine Hill, George Elvizas come speak to us. It's an evening event on Thursday at 5 p.m. So registration for the event is free. So I hope you can join us. And again, thank you all for joining us today. Have a great day. And this meeting is now adjourned.